War Between Worlds, Chapter 12, Good for You. They made it back to Earth in about half the time they had taken to get there in the Harvester. They were both pretty quiet on their way. When they reached Earth, they sat down next to the proto-truck, which Rook took back to the base. Jen followed in the skiff. She landed and frowned, waving to Rook, who was heading off to make his report. Jen made her way deep into the base. The Bellwood base was a bit complicated. Most terrestrial plumber bases were simple, with quarters and other basic necessities of the resident plumbers. This base was more complex. It was technically two bases, the original having never been fully decommissioned after the new one was built. The whole still rested under Ed's mechanic shop, though almost no one went to this section of the base. No one had bothered to update the hardware here, since it wasn't going to be used. But Jen was surprised to find that she wasn't alone down here. Pierce Wheels sat at the console, fiddling with something. He looked up when the door opened. "Oh, hey, Jen. You and Rook made it back okay, then?" Jen nodded, sitting down next to him. "Yeah, we did. Bit worried about what the incursions are planning, but we made it back in one piece." Pierce grinned, glancing down at his datapad. "Everything okay?" Pierce nodded. "Yeah, just got a message from Helen and the Max Force." Jen grinned. She hadn't heard from anyone on the Max Force, except, of course, Cooper and Pierce, in ages. "What are they up to these days?" Pierce grinned. "Alan is working rescue in extreme heat." Jen laughed. Alan hadn't been much for picking fights. He'd do well with rescue work. "Manny and Helen are being assigned to Koros 5. "Tetraman Homeworld?" Jen asked, and Pierce nodded. "They're good at violence. Tetramans respect that." Jen nodded. "That they do. Just make sure they know to be careful before challenging anyone to a fight. They might end up with a fiancé they don't want." Pierce laughed. Jen poked him in the chest. "I'm serious and speak from personal experience." Pierce choked on his laughter. "I know. That's why it's funny." Jen let out a chuckle as Pierce managed to control his laughter. "But they want me to come see them before they head off. It would be nice." Jen shrugged. "You'll be getting off light duty soon. Go have some fun while you still can. I think there's a transport leaving for that sector day after tomorrow." Pierce tapped his datapad a few times and nodded. "You're right." Then he frowned. "How do you know that? You haven't even been on planet in the last few days." Jen shrugged. "Gotta keep an eye on things. I like to know when the scheduled comings and goings happen. That way, if something is unscheduled, I already know." Jen winked, and Pierce laughed again. "No wonder you're so good at this job." Jen shrugged. "If only I was as good at school, maybe my history teacher would get off my back." Pierce frowned slightly. "I mean, technically you could drop out. Not like you wouldn't have a job." Jen gave an exaggerated gasp, slapping her hand to her chest as though she was having a heart attack. "Pierce Wheels! What kind of example would that set?" She laughed slightly. "I mean, I'm already a menace in the eyes of a lot of adults. Can you imagine the look on Harangue's face if I dropped out of school?" You'd be practically doing his job for him." Jen shook her head, laughing. Pierce laughed for another moment, too, before shaking his head. "What are you doing in the hole, anyway?" Jen shrugged. "Dunno. Craving when things were simpler, I guess. Before I got famous. Back when the biggest thing I had to worry about was curfew." She sighed, spinning her chair. "Time moves on. We must, too," Pierce said. Jen frowned at him. "Is that a quote?" Pierce shrugged. "No idea." Jen laughed and stood. "I'm gonna head home for the night. Spend it at home instead of at the base." Pierce nodded at Jen. "You should go see your sister. It'll be good for you." "Yeah, I think I will." Jen smiled at her friend. "Tell them I say hi." With that, she left the base entirely, taking the elevator up to Ed's mechanic shop and summoning her motorcycle. She rode it back to her parents' house and let herself in. They had a nice dinner, but it took a long time for Jen to fall asleep in her old room. It somehow didn't feel as much like home as it used to. She had gotten used to her room at the base. She sighed and turned over. There was a soft knock on the door and she sat up. Her mother poked her head into the room. "Oh, good, you're still awake. We hadn't gotten a chance to get this to you at the base." She was holding a small box. Jen frowned. "It's not my birthday for another month or so." Sandra Tennyson nodded. "I know that, silly. It's from that little lilac farm in France, the one your friend George left you." Jen blinked and took the box from her mother. She had completely forgotten about most of the things George had left her. The only things that had been important were the Bellwood house and the house in England, though she hadn't gotten a chance to go there yet. She pulled her dagger from the sheath on her calf and gently cut the box open, slipping the dagger back into its place as her mother rolled her eyes slightly. Inside the box was a note carefully penned in English. "Dear Miss Tennyson, my name is Gabrielle Bardin, and my family runs the lilac farm bequeathed to you by Mr. George Eternius. When we heard about the death of Mr. Eternius, we were devastated. He was a very close friend of my great-grandfather's. We are very grateful that you have decided to let us retain our way of doing things as Mr. Eternius had done for years. My son Ryan is a big fan of yours and was pleased beyond words that he may someday get the chance to meet you. It was his idea to name a new perfume after you. We decided to not do it directly as we weren't sure how you would feel about it. Included in this package is a bottle of Juste 10, roughly translated to just 10. We hope you enjoy it. Thank you for your continued support." Jen read the note aloud as her father joined her mother in the doorway to her room. She pulled out a bubble-wrapped container and unwrapped it to find a blown glass bottle in the shape of the Omnitrix symbol. She grinned. There was a short note here, too. "I have a friend who blows glass. He's a fan, too. Gee." She sniffed the perfume, lilac, which made sense. At the bottom of the box was a photo of the Bardin family. Jen pulled it out and studied it. She smiled slightly, shaking her head. The resemblance to her friend George was uncanny. The youngest member of the family, a boy in a green jersey with a large white number 10 on it, was George in miniature. You old scoundrel. She would bet good money that George had been their great-grandfather, maybe a few greats, really, and made it his mission to ensure that his family was well cared for no matter what happened to him. She had a suspicion that if she investigated the vineyard in Italy, she would find it was a similar arrangement. If they knew the truth or not was anyone's guess, but Jen set the perfume on her shelf and slipped the photo of her old friend's family into her bookcase. "Everything okay, Jen?" her father asked, and she nodded, glancing over at her parents. They were both wearing the emergency teleport necklaces. She nodded again. "Yeah, Dad. Everything's fine." Chapter 13. Beginning of the War. 2 days passed in a quiet, tense fog. No one was sure what Atea had planned or what she and Dr. Psychobos had or where she and Dr. Psychobos had gone, with the small dose they had left of the mind control juice. There was no sign of them anywhere, not even a whisper. It was starting to drive Jen up the wall. She shook her head, drumming her fingers on the door of the proto-truck. Traffic was at an absolute standstill. That certainly didn't help. Rook frowned. "You have been tense the past few days. Are you well?" Jen shrugged. "Just a bad feeling. Any word from Ravana?" Rook nodded. "Yes, actually. Shar called me last night. With the help of the plumbers, there have been over 24 camps of incursions arrested." Jen nodded. That was good. She had been really worried about Atea maybe heading back to Ravana. It seemed that she didn't quite know that when she'd taken it over, she had a family full of valuable hostages in Rook's family. She looked out the window again. "I'm glad none of them got hurt." Rook smiled, but Jen had focused on something outside of the window. "The hell is going on out there?" she asked as she unbuckled her seatbelt and hopped out of the truck. Rook frowned, looking out the windshield. Something was indeed happening out there. The cars that had been passing through the light, they were a few cars behind, had veered off out of the intersection. The asphalt was rumbling. Rook stepped out of the proto-truck as Jen made it to the crosswalk. Rook wasn't quite as quick as her, though, and did not reach her before the ground in front of the crosswalk split outward. The center of the intersection split open, breaking outward, sending rocks flying and crashing into windshields. Jen ducked slightly, but stepped a bit closer to the newly created hole. Out of it shot several ships racing up into the atmosphere, followed quickly by what must have been half the population of Undertown racing up and out of the atmosphere as fast as their ships would allow. One ship, slowed by a variety of things strapped to it, allowed its pilot to shout a quite clear warning. "The incursions are coming!" Jen swore as panic stole over the people surrounding the newly opened hole into Undertown. She turned to Rook. "Call headquarters. This panic is going to spread quickly." He nodded, racing back to the truck as a few more spaceships raced out of the hole in the ground. Jen pulled out her cell phone and quickly dialed a number. "Lieutenant Steele? Yeah, we have major problems incoming." Jen was correct, to no one's surprise, but the level of their problems were on the rise a bit faster than they had predicted. They were facing an open war bearing down on them from the skies in the form of an incursion fleet bearing down on the planet, and sheer panic on the streets from the very inelegant reveal of Undertown to the people living above them. Jen hated this part of her job. She was good at hitting things. She was a decent tactician, but handling people was not her department. This was normally Gwen's job. It didn't sit well with Jen, sitting on a stage that had been tossed together while the others were all prepping for the imminent invasion. Listening to Steele give the crowd the basics was boring, but she was already here. "As the public has been made aware, there has been a settlement of extraterrestrials living under Bellwood, California for some time. Yes, the government has been aware of this since the settlement Undertown was established almost 2 years ago." Jen blinked slightly. That was slightly new information. That meant that Undertown had been formed just after her defeat of the Highbreed, but she would think about that later. There were other things happening right now. "What about the rumors running rampant that an alien invasion is approaching Earth?" one of the reporters demanded. Steele nodded. "To speak on these rumors, we have our liaison with the Plumbers and Intergalactic Police Force, Miss Jen Tennyson." Jen stood to a few whispers and stepped up to the podium as Steele stepped aside. He looked slightly relieved as he turned his back on the crowd. She would have rolled her eyes at him, but she was currently facing down at least 6 different cameras. She nodded to the crowd, looking over the cards that she'd been given. She took a deep breath. "As of 1 hour ago, Plumber radar picked up several possibly hostile ships entering the solar system. There's a planetary shield in place, and the Plumbers are preparing for every eventuality. If the shield is breached, a warning will be sent out to the general populace. As of this moment, the Plumbers recommend that people go home and shelter there." There were a few raised hands in the crowd, but before Jen could answer any of their questions, William Harangue stood up and shouted above everyone else, "They're here to pick a fight with you, aren't they? This is your fault!" Steele stood from his seat. "Calm down or you will be removed from this meeting, Mr. Harangue." Jen shook her head slightly at Steele before she turned to Harangue. "No, they're not here to pick a fight with me. This is what the incursions do. They try to expand their empire. When this meeting is done, I will be rejoining the Plumbers to help them with the plans to see the incursions off. But rest assured, we will be ready if they decide they want a fight." Harangue glared, but Steele took back over, ending the press conference before Harangue could continue his usual attacks against her. He stepped up to her as the press was shown out and shook her hand. "Good luck, Miss Tennyson." She nodded to him. "You too, Lieutenant. We're all going to need it in the next few days."